we've been talking about this a lot, right? About the spiritual warfare that's going on here. The railhead of all this is a spiritual war. In the middle of this, Catholicism, as we have many traditional Catholics who listen to this show and watch the show, have really been at war almost with their own church. And of course, the Pope throws down incredibly hard. I want to bring in Eric Sammons from Crisis Magazine. If you haven't looked at Crisis Magazine, go to the website and check it out. Incredibly important periodical and website that has breaking news all the time. Eric, walk us through what's exactly going on. What is your article outline? I want to put the article across the board in all of our platforms and up on the site right now, and of course at Denver, put it up on the screen. Eric, walk us through what you call, I guess, spiritual abuse.
Right. For some reason, Pope Francis seems to think that people who attend the traditional Latin Mass, for those who aren't sure what that is, that's the Mass as it was celebrated before the 1960s Vatican II Council. He seems to think those people are the biggest problem in the church today, when in fact, as most people know, the Catholic Church has been crumbling for some time now. Lots of people are leaving. Millions of people, are leaving the Catholic Church. And it's the traditional Latin Mass that's actually growing. It's the one part of the church that's growing is the traditional Latin Mass. And for some reason, the Pope thinks this is a thing we have to shut down. And I think it's because it's the one group in the church that recognizes that the emperor has no clothes, meaning all the things that Pope Francis is trying to do is actually harming the Catholic Church. It's harming the ability for the Catholic Church to preach the message of Jesus Christ, to preach the coming of Jesus Christ at Christmas. All these things that the Pope does harms that. And yet, and the traditional Latin Mass community is saying, the emperor has no clothes. What you're doing is actually harming people. And he knows that, so he wants to crush them. And so he's making all these moves to make it more difficult for priests to say the traditional Latin Mass, for bishops to allow it. He's just adding restriction upon restriction, and he just added some more this past Saturday, just a week before Christmas.
And what did he do this past Saturday? He threw down even harder, correct?
Right. So what he's done is he's added more restrictions. He's made it so that, for example, you can't celebrate ordinations or confirmations in the traditional rite. He's made it so that you can't celebrate both the new rite and the old rite on the same weekday. A priest can't do that. He's made it so bishops, it's much more difficult for bishops to allow priests to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. And the most comical thing is he's actually said you're not allowed to advertise traditional Latin Mass times in your church bulletin. So literally the Pope is saying in Rome is saying that some parish in Des Moines that wants to have a traditional Latin Mass can't put it in their bulletin. That's how ridiculous and how comical this is.
Okay, this is what I think it's hard for people to get, particularly people that are Christians and not Catholics, is that in a church that's clearly bleeding out attendance, you can go to any church in the United States and see how the pews are empty. And this is not even, let's leave the COVID situation aside for a second. Why would anybody that's rational take the part of the church that's growing, which is the traditional part of the church, particularly with young priests, right, and people dedicating themselves to Christ for their life? Why would anybody that's the head of that operation try to shut down the part of that that's actually growing?
I think it's ideological. Pope Francis has invested himself with a certain view of the church, of the Catholic Church. It's very much embedded in his views of what happened in the 1960s with all the changes in the Catholic Church. And simply he can't admit that he's wrong, that those things have led to, they haven't helped, but they've actually led to this decline. They've helped cause this decline. And so for him, he's just doubling down and saying, no, if I just get rid of these meddlesome traditionalists, then everything's going to be okay, when we all know that's exactly the opposite is going to happen. It's just going to shrink even more. So I think it comes down to ideological reasons, not spiritual reasons.
Let's go to Ben Harnwell. We still have Ben in Rome. Ben, you've been working this for years. As quite frankly, this is how we met, I think, 10 years ago or longer ago than that. What's your assessment? Is Eric Sammons correct? Is his theory of the case correct, that ideologically the Pope is so far to the left, and with the the social justice warrior part of the church, that he's trying to crush this growing and vibrant and urgent traditional part of the church?
Well, firstly, Steve, I just want to say it's a great honor for me to be on this segment along with Eric Sammons. I follow Crisis Magazine every day, and everyone listening should certainly do that, because it's great with the news and the interpretation. It is certainly ideological, right? Because Francis is really represents the last holdout of that revolutionary 1968 generation. But beyond that, having been in Rome for 10 years and have studied this pontificate extremely closely, I'd like to, and I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I'd like to make a speculative point that beyond being ideological, and it is ideological, but beyond that, I think there's a psychological element here. I personally believe that this Pope suffers from narcissistic personality disorder, right? NPD. I think his primary problem with traditionalists is that, and I spent a lot of time amongst traditionalists over the years, it's that in their whole spiritual outlook, they concentrate their lives on Jesus Christ, right? In the sacrament especially, right? And I don't think the Pope psychologically can handle that, because he wants Catholics to be emotionally and spiritually focused on him and on what he says. And when he comes to these traditionalist movements, and they're clearly focused on Christ, especially in the sacrament, he takes that as a personal rejection.
Wow. I'm glad we got that guy as the head of the church. That's a pretty damning analysis. Eric Sammons, the question is, what are people to do about this now? If Ben Harnwell is even close to being correct, what are traditional Catholics supposed to do now that they're basically being treated as unwelcome guests in their church, sir?
I think in general, as much as possible, they should ignore these commands, just completely ignore them. I think they need to urge their bishops, more importantly, to ignore them. I was actually happy to see back in the summer when the Pope first started to do this, a lot of American bishops in particular simply ignored it and simply just didn't follow it. And what I'm hoping is that the same thing happens here, because honestly, this is an administrative headache for bishops, and they're administrators first and foremost these days. And for them, the traditional mass communities, they don't bother them. So they'll just keep doing what you're doing. I don't care. And now all of a sudden the Pope's saying, no, you have to go crush them. And so I think that's just a headache for them.
But if the Pope's saying crush them and you're saying don't pay attention, aren't you driving? Isn't this going to lead to a schism?
I hope and pray it doesn't. But that's exactly, I think, what the Pope wants to do. I think he wants to actually cause a schism where traditional Catholics leave the Catholic Church. But the fact is, it's our church, and so we're not going to leave it. And the Pope will eventually die. And so we pray that the next pontiff will just reverse this. Because after all, he reversed the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, who liberalized saying the Latin Mass. So what my prayer is that the next Pope will simply say, okay, we're going to ignore all that. We're going to rescind what Pope Francis did. So I do think that Pope actually wants to cause a schism. He wants us to leave. But I just say we just simply refuse to leave.
That's a pretty blockbuster. That's a pretty blockbuster statement. You believe the Pope is driving a schism in the church to drive the traditional Catholic. This is a church that's losing attendance everywhere because of all the scandals, and now you've got all these woke priests. And you're saying that he wants to drive a schism to force out the traditional Catholics from the church?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. I think he wants to try to drive people. There's a group called the Society of St. Pius X, which isn't in schism, but it's kind of in an irregular situation. And I think he wants to drive us all to that group, and then he will kick that group out and basically force them into schism. And I think that's what he hopes happens, because then he doesn't have to deal with us, because we're not part of the church anymore in his mind.
How do people follow you on social media? How do they get to Crisis Magazine and get to your writings? Because this is pretty explosive.
Right. So you already mentioned crisismagazine.com is our website. We're on all the social platforms. We're on Getter. We're on Twitter. We're all the place at Crisis Mag. That's our handle on all these different places. I'm also on all of them at Eric R. Salmon, so you can follow me on all those different social media platforms as well.
Eric, we know you got a book coming out. We're going to talk about that more later. We're going to have you back on. Pretty explosive. Ben Harnwell, thank you very much for your analysis and your commentary. We will see you tomorrow. International editor stationed in Rome. Pretty serious and pretty scary. Talking about schism in the church in the middle of all of this.